Today I'm doing a video that I have wanted to do for a very long time because I have been growing tomatoes in containers on my balcony for years, and a lot of people in my everyday life actually ask me how I do it and if I have any guidance or advice. And I thought it might be interesting to do a video on this topic just in case there's more people out there who have some of the same questions as some of my friends and family do. I really like growing tomatoes because they're one of the most satisfying plants to grow in a container. Aesthetically, they're really nice. They obviously are useful because I put the tomatoes in salads, and I especially love tomatoes with cheese and pasta. So great. Olive oil, balsamic vinegar, salt, pepper, like that's just an amazing, oh, and of course basil. It's an amazing combination for summer. Now, there are many reasons why you might want to grow tomatoes in a container. One, and the most obvious reason, is that you don't have any space to plant anything in the ground. So this has been more or less my case for probably over 10 years. The first year I ever tried it, I experimented. The tomatoes did pretty well, and so I have continued to grow them ever since. And I think I've been growing tomatoes in containers for probably 7 or 8 years now. In my opinion, or in my experience, tomatoes grown in containers will never get quite as massive or as productive as a tomato that is grown in the ground, like in really good rich soil. If you don't have great soil for growing tomatoes, then maybe you do want to try growing tomatoes in containers because you can control the quality and the type of soil that the tomato is exposed to, and who knows, they might actually do better where you live just based on the type of land or ground that you have. In my case, where I am, the soil is actually really very rich. So interestingly, as of this year, I have a community garden space where I have this 10 foot by 10 foot square area where I have been growing some tomato plants, and it's been really interesting to see kind of a comparison between growing the same exact tomatoes planted at the same exact time in the ground versus the tomatoes that I grow in the containers. Both are producing right now, which is actually a little bit early. I'm filming this in mid-July, and usually tomatoes here tend to start to be harvested in early August. So they're about 2 weeks ahead of schedule this year, which is kind of fun. But I have most definitely been finding that tomatoes that I planted in the ground are way bigger than the tomatoes that I have here growing in containers on my balcony. With all that said, that doesn't mean that you can't enjoy a great tomato harvest if all you have is like a balcony space or space to grow your tomatoes in containers. So let's start at the very, very beginning, which is, when do you plant tomatoes, and should you plant them from seed, or should you go to a greenhouse and buy little plant starts? For the past couple of years, I have grown tomatoes from seed, and the reason for this is I like looking through seed catalogs in the winter and picking out specific varieties that I think will do better where I live. Some of the things that I think about are, well, sometimes seed catalogs will actually tell you if a tomato will do okay in a container or not, so that's always useful. Generally speaking, I find that cherry tomatoes and grape tomatoes do better in containers than, say, those full-sized slicer tomatoes or San Marzano tomatoes, or, larger tomatoes don't tend to love being in containers. So I really enjoy starting tomatoes from seed. I usually plant them in a little seed starting mix and put them on a heat mat and under a grow light about 6 to 8 weeks before my last frost date. So that's when you want to plant tomatoes from seeds. Now, this past year, I have to tell you, was the first time in maybe 4 or 5 years that I have had zero success. Well, I guess only limited success, I should say, starting tomatoes from seed. I don't know what happened, but my tomato seeds that I planted in late March, which is when I always do it, they came up, they germinated, everything seemed fine. They got their first set of leaves, okay. Second set of leaves, which are the real tomato leaves, I was like, okay, this is great. But then after about 2 weeks, all of my tomato seedlings, every single one of them, stopped growing. So I had planted many different varieties. I had taken really good care of them like I always do other years, and had never had any issues like that other years. So basically for 4 or 5 weeks they did absolutely nothing. They didn't grow at all, and they eventually started dying. I don't know exactly what happened. I think the problem was actually the seed starting mix. Anyway, that experience aside, you know, normally it's actually pretty easy to start tomatoes from seeds, so don't let that scare you away. Okay, I thought I would show you a few of the tomato seeds that I have grown successfully in containers in the past, since I don't have the plants to show you. So one of my favorites is this one. It's Napa Chardonnay. I got it from Baker Creek. It's really, really good, really prolific little tomato that pretty much produces for a really long season. The only thing is it's really juicy, so if you're not into like super juicy cherry tomatoes, might not be for you, but I really love it. Another one of my favorites, you can't see the name right here, but it's called the Ice's cherry tomato. Really pretty little orangish red cherry tomato. Also seems to do great in containers. I love it. And I don't have the package, I saved the seeds. These are Sunrise Bumblebee, and so these are also my absolute favorite. They're kind of an orangey red as well, little cherry tomato, but they're super delicious, super delicious, and they seem to like containers. And then this one is the only larger tomato I've ever tried to grow in a container, or not the only one I've ever tried, but the only one I've been relatively successful with. This is Dr. Witchy, I'm not sure how to pronounce the name actually, his yellow tomato, and again from Baker Creek, super delicious tomato, and produces a couple in containers. You're not going to get the massive yield that you might get if you planted this in the ground, but it's not bad for a container. The final one I want to show you is one that I tried, but I actually don't recommend, and I'm mentioning it because it is marketed for containers. It's called the Micro Tom, and it says, you know, you can grow it in a really tiny terracotta pot like they have, you know, like they're showing on the package. The problem I found with this one was that it definitely grew, and it grew in a relatively small container, and it's a cute little plant, but it's not very prolific. I've grown it a couple of times to try it out. I never got this many tomatoes that they're showing on the picture here, and in fact I only got like a small handful. I think I got 5 or 6 total from all of the effort I put into it. I just didn't find it was worth it, and they weren't very good. I ended up feeding them to my guinea pigs. So just kind of wanted to mention that one didn't work out, but wanted to give you a few ideas of ones that have worked for me. The biggest problem with buying tomato plants from a greenhouse or nursery is often when greenhouses and nurseries get tomato plants in at the beginning of the season in the spring, the plants are quite often huge. They're an inappropriate size for the weather conditions and the time of year where you are located, and so you could hypothetically get a very mature plant that's just been in this tiny greenhouse container for the last, you know, however many weeks, and the tomato plant might have flowers, it might even have little green tomatoes, and it's only spring where you are. So basically tomatoes are a late summer fruit. You want them to flower in maybe July or June if you're in a warmer climate, and then produce tomatoes in July or August, or even into September, kind of depending on how far north or south you are located. Tomatoes should not be producing little tomatoes in spring. That will basically limit the life and productivity of a tomato to kind of have it be forced to produce earlier than it's really supposed to. So essentially the two benefits are knowing what you're getting and also having an appropriately sized tomato plant when you're actually planting it out in the summer, you know, after your last frost date. With that said, you can still go to some good garden centers and buy plant starts. I had to do that this year, so what I looked for were tomato plants that were labeled with like detailed labels about what the tomato variety was, so I would know what I was growing. And then I also looked for plants that were no larger than about 12 inches tall, about a foot tall, with no flowers, and of course no mini tomatoes starting to grow on them. Your next step, once you have your tomato plant, you also need a good container to grow your tomato in. So I have a lot of opinions on this. This is just my experience. So first of all, you're going to want to get the largest container you can get. I know that if you have limited space, if you're growing on a balcony, you won't necessarily be able to fit a very large container onto your balcony. I always use terracotta pots, no matter what. And the size of the terracotta pot that I get is always with a diameter that's no smaller than 12 inches or a foot across. It's ideal for it to be even larger, like maybe 14 or 16 inches diameter. But I don't necessarily always have enough space for that many pots of that size. But basically I get the largest terracotta pot that I can find and that I can fit in the space where I'm going to be growing my tomatoes. I only put one plant per pot. And another thing that I do, always plan on putting a little bit of basil with each plant. So a lot of people are worried that, you have to space plants out. I actually find that basil and tomato are amazing companion plants. They don't seem to crowd each other out. They grow really well together, and in fact, it's said that both of their flavors will improve when they're planted next to each other. So I always put a little bit of basil, a little bit of a basil plant in with each individual tomato plant that's in that terracotta pot. Now, why a terracotta pot? Okay, basically one of the reasons why I believe tomatoes do way better in the ground, in the soil, is because the temperature is really well regulated in the ground. You're not going to have the soil warm up quite as extremely in the middle of the day or cool down as quickly at night. However, when you're growing tomatoes, or any other plant for that matter, in a container, the soil is its temperature is going to fluctuate a lot throughout the day. So it will get really hot in the middle of the day, especially if there's sun directly on it. And then at night, the heat might back off, but then a few hours later when the sun comes up again, the plant's going to get hot. The problem is the roots don't love those extreme fluctuations in temperature. So to kind of mitigate that problem when you're growing in containers, I have found that terracotta is the best possible material to regulate temperature. You think terracotta is just made of, sand, clay. It's, I guess, the closest thing you can give the plant to actually being in the ground. That's just my experience. Now, other people try growing them in plastic, in like those fabric grow bags, maybe in a wooden container. I haven't tried planting tomatoes in a wooden container. Maybe that would work. The fabric containers I find dry out really fast, and again, they can get super, super hot in the middle of the day, especially if the tomato is in the full sun. I had a tomato planted in a black fabric pot, and just forget about it. It was struggling because it was so hot, and I think its roots were way too hot. In my opinion, the worst possible container you could plant a tomato in is a plastic container. There's a couple of reasons. First of all, I would not want to plant anything edible in a plastic container unless it was a food grade, like food safe plastic. So you have to look into that. Not all containers that are plastic sold at garden centers are food safe. But really the biggest problem I have with the plastic container is that the plants will tend to fry. So I have a great example of that. My neighbor has been trying to grow tomato plants all summer, and the tomato plants are completely fried, and I see them just dying a little bit more every single day. They're not doing anything, they're not producing anything. The reason is he has them in these black plastic containers. They're just going to be too hot in those. They're also too small, but yeah, those two things combined, lethal to tomatoes. The rest of the things about growing tomatoes in containers, you can more or less follow the same instructions as growing tomatoes in general. I do find you have to water tomatoes a lot more, and other plants that are planted in containers. Always feel into the pot to make sure that it's dry, especially with tomatoes. I do let them dry out in between waterings, but not for long. I don't let them stay dry for too long. And one of the reasons you don't want to overwater tomatoes is because the tomato fruit will actually split if it gets too much water. You'll notice this if it rains a lot. Yeah, I just let the soil dry out a bit in between waterings. I do fertilize my tomatoes as well. So at the beginning of the summer, I always put in fresh soil. I think that's the first thing to do. I use a combination of potting soil and compost. I happen to use like a very rich seafood or seaweed based compost, and I mix that in with kind of a general potting mix, about half and half. And so that gets the plants started off at the beginning of the summer in some really nutritious soil. Then as the summer goes on, once a month I add a organic fertilizer that's good for tomatoes and vegetables. I just follow the instructions on the bag of fertilizer for, you know, how much to give. So other than that, I mean, the rest is just kind of a waiting game. Waiting, watching the tomato plant to see if it flowers, to see if it sets fruit. Obviously there's all kinds of issues that people could have with their tomato plants, but I think as long as you've set your tomato plant up well in its container, you can pretty much follow the instructions in terms of how to grow a tomato, just like anyone else would with a tomato plant in the ground. So it's been 6 weeks since I filmed the first part of this video. I thought I would show you how the tomato harvest turned out. I've harvested most of the tomatoes I'm going to get this year, I think, so yeah, I can let you know. So I have this little bowl of tomatoes, and I've eaten a lot of the tomatoes that we picked. This is just a fraction of what I got. I believe I said in the video, cherry tomatoes are really dependable when you're growing them in a container on the balcony, and so this year they did pretty well. It is currently towards the end of August, and usually my tomato production, I would say, slows down by this time of year. I'll get a few more into September, but usually by September 10, September 15, at least where I live, that's pretty much the end of the tomatoes. So this was one of the sweet 100s. This one did pretty well. These were pretty early actually, and it looks like I'm going to get a few more maybe. Yeah, so I do have a few of these sweet 100 tomato flowers still. This is the pineapple tomato, which was new to me this year, and it still hasn't ripened, so I have no idea how it's going to turn out, how it's going to taste. This is my remaining Dr. Witchy, which is just starting to ripen right now. I got two others. One has been eaten, the other one is inside, and it's going to be eaten tonight. This is one of the bumblebee tomatoes. These did really well. I picked a lot of these both here and in my community garden space. I also had a plant there. So this is the black tomato. It's called Midnight Snack. It also did pretty well. It was very prolific. And I figured out that you do have to wait until the bottom turns a little bit red before picking it. I don't think I have any ripe ones here. See, this one you can see is still kind of green on the bottom, so it's not ready yet. They get just the hint of red out here. That's a good example of one. So they get a hint of red. Oop, and that one's actually overripe. I just felt it pop. I'll give it to my guinea pigs. But yeah, so that one is ripe. And finally, these were the Sun Golds. They also did pretty well. That one's just about ripe. I've had a few of them split because it's been really hot. And yeah, these have been delicious. They're probably my favorite. I think I'm going to end up growing that again. So I hope this was helpful to anyone who's thinking about growing tomatoes in containers, or if you're just gardening in a tiny space and you want to, you know, expand the amount or the variety of different plants you're growing in those spaces. Let me know if this was useful, and let me know if I missed anything, if you have any tips about how to grow tomatoes effectively in a container. I'd be really curious. Anyway, happy growing, and let me know how it goes for you.